Hey, everybody, welcome to another special episode of the Fantasy Fiends podcast. Today was going to be much more of an official structured thing, but some of our guests haven't shown up yet, so we are just hanging out and talking general fantasy right now with some pretty awesome people. Nick, everybody knows you, but for any, that one person in the corner of the universe who doesn't, why don't you introduce yourself?
You mean my grandma?
Yeah, exactly.
My name is Nicholas Eames. I'm the author of two books in a series called The Band. The first one's called Kings of the Wild. The second is called Bloody Rose.
And the third one, you were just telling me the name.
Was I? Well, it's actually called Outlaw Empire.
That's pretty badass.
The title got away from us anyway, so Outlaw Empire. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
Also, I've seen the cover almost 2 years ago, and it's beautiful too. I just need to write a book that's worthy of it.
Yeah, that's always the hard part.
But those characters are locked in.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And Daniel?
I'm a geek who likes talking about fantasy and is somehow making a living doing it now. That's pretty much it.
That's very cool. We have a comment from the audience that Stevie is looking pretty hot today. I'm pretty sure she's talking about you, Daniel. Stevie's my usual co-host. He doesn't get to show up on these ones because he's not cool enough. So you're an upgrade for the day.
I hope I live up to it. Excuse me.
So today, just before we started the podcast, we were talking. Daniel does a lot of these videos, like the top 10 most powerful characters, and we were having a little bit of a spirited debate about why Nick is wrong that Randall Thor would beat Animander Rake. But Daniel, I guess what would be probably the most controversial of these lists that you've created?
Well, I was flat out wrong several times. I'm very vocally open to admitting that. Once I very much so devalued Rake. And recently, I kind of just forgot about some healing factors that are prevalent in Stormlight. So I accidentally devalued all those characters a lot. My only defense is I read so many books that, yes, it becomes difficult to say this one belongs there, this one belongs here. But they're just fun to do because they get a lot of feedback, a lot of people giving strong opinions. And I always just dig that so much. I love learning I'm wrong because it means I've learned more.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, welcome.
Man, I'm using my wife's computer, and it's like trying to, because I don't have a camera on the one in my office. As soon as I log onto the damn thing and goes updating, I'm like, you got to be kidding.
Windows curse.
The
joys of Windows. Windows 10 is always just the most inconvenient.
Dude, this is an old computer, so it's like more like Windows Vista.
Oh.
No, it's really not.
Okay. I was going to say, I didn't think that was supported anymore, so congratulations.
Windows 88.
I think it's actually Windows 7 that I bought. This is I bought this laptop years and years ago, and I still use it on the road to write with, So.
Very cool. Well, Brian, we were just getting started. Why don't you tell everybody who you are?
My name is Brian D. Anderson. The D is for a double dose of my bad writing. I'm a fantasy author. I was an independent author for about 9 years. About 2 years ago, Tor Books decided to pick me up, and I released my first traditional work through them this past January, entitled The Bard's Blade. And got the second one coming out in August, and having a lot of fun with it. So that's
very cool.
There's Alexi.
Well, hey, Alexi, welcome. Glad you could make it.
Hey, guys. How you doing today?
Very good.
Why don't you give us a few words about you, who you are, what you're bringing to this awesome episode?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me on here. My name is Alexi Vandenburg. I am the owner of Rapid Fanboy Marketing, which specializes in literary marketing for authors, as well as Bard's Tower, which is the literary celebrity experience that goes from convention to convention, essentially highlighting authors ranging from New York Times bestsellers all the way down to authors who are independents and building up their career. And I am now the sole owner of Prince of Cats Literary Productions, which is going to be a book production company that will be working with authors of all shapes and sizes, pretty much to produce their books, just like a movie producer would produce a movie.
Very cool. Very cool. So, we're talking the state of the fantasy genre, and we have to go back to the beginning. We've got guys like Robert Howard, J.R.R. Tolkien, the guys who got it started. Let me ask you all, what was like the first fantasy book? What is your first exposure to fantasy? Anybody?
Oh, wow. Okay. For me, my first fantasy novel was actually at 7. And I actually was horribly sick with the flu, and my mother came home with a box of books that she got at a garage sale. And in that were a bunch of Star Trek pocket books, Han Solo at Star's Edge, as well as the Hobbit and the trilogy, and a book by Barbara Hambly, which was called The Silicon Mage. It was a duology.
Wow. Dude, I personally was, we just spent the night at my grandparents' house from time to time. And my uncle was like a hippie back in the 60s. And he actually tried to go to Woodstock and made it about halfway there and came home. I'd stay in his old bedroom, and he had all these Tom Swift books. Tom Swift Jr. I don't know if you're familiar with those. Back in the original ones were around the 19 teens, and then they came out with Tom Swift Jr. back in the 50s and 60s, and you came around at the same time all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews were coming out, and they had these just beautiful, neat covers, and I would read those, and he actually ended up giving them to me a few years back because I loved them so much. But he also had an old copy of Fellowship of the Ring, and it's old, just beat up paperback, mass market paperback. Pages were faded, you know what I mean? And I didn't read it at first because I didn't really dig the cover. And when you're a little kid, that's what attracts you to books, you know. But finally I did, and I started reading it. I loved it, and I wanted to take it home with me, but of course it was his book. So and there was no cell phones and shit like that back then. So I had to get permission to bring it home with me. Otherwise I could only read it when we visited my grandparents. By the time I finished, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I thought I was as brilliant as Tolkien. Wrote about 3 pages, showed it to my uncle, and he hurt my little feelings from his laughter.
But that's how that's
You're
how
never
every
invited back to Uncle's house.
That's how we learn.
Laughing at me, but you know what I mean? Come on, y'all. I could do that. I could.
Well, Brian, that's where every author starts.
I will agree with that.
They start with a bad book that goes, "Oh my God, this book is horrible. I can do way better than that." and you know,
well, it predates Dunning-Kruger. It predates Dunning-Kruger effect.
That's cool. Daniel, what about you? Where did you get started in fantasy?
I feel like every time I'm asked this, I answer it differently because I have a different memory. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast, and it's only 1 p.m. But I think the earliest books I came across were either Redwall or Harry Potter, and those were a long, long time ago. And in terms of like rereading and appreciating as an adult, Redwall is a lot better than I remember it being. It's good. And then I would say the first, my parents aren't like reading it to me. I'm getting it on my own, reading it, was probably either His Dark Materials or Wheel of Time. They were right around the same time. And I definitely didn't pick up on all the lofty themes of His Dark Materials my first time through at 10 or 11. But it's definitely kind of helped shape I love fantasy that has something to say, but is very tactful in how it says it. That's something I've always appreciated. I don't like the just blunt force approach. I like a kind of a balance of, here are the author's opinions posed more really with care and woven into the narrative. And that's always a skill that's kind of just been consistent now forever because of that beginning route I had there.
Interesting.
I feel really, really, really old.
I think I'm older than you. I think I'm older than you, man.
I'm 25, so I'm. A lot of people still call me a baby, which I'll accept, I guess.
I'm 54. So
okay, yeah, you're older than me.
I'm 54, and it's funny because I remember, I explained to a lot of authors that are young today. They're like, oh well, fantasy genre is where it's at, and I was like, actually, it's funny because in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't. It wasn't where it was. Science fiction was the genre of choice, or the area of choice for genre fiction. It's why, Anne McCaffrey pushed Dragon Riders of Pern as, well, it's a planet where they ride dragons. Just
Sci-fi.
go with it.
Yeah.
Because it was going to be able to put it into the sci-fi genre. Now, let's just be honest. It's fantasy with the serial numbers just kind of, smudged. They're not even filed off. They're smudged. But, it's funny, Brian, that you mentioned covers, because I think where fantasy began to emerge was with the really dynamic covers of the meta, the entire fantasy genre, whether we like it or not now, and let's just be honest, the aesthetic is not quite there anymore, but the entire fantasy genre owes a huge debt to Frank Frazetta, because I remember looking at the covers of like Conan the Barbarian and Fard and the Grey Mouser, where you're looking at these covers and you don't even know what is happening, but you're looking at that cover and going, oh my God, I must buy this. It looks amazing.
I want to feel as epic as this looks.
Yeah, right. I think with Daniel,
winner, chicken dinner
had more effect on him than anything.
What was that? I didn't hear
I think
that.
with Daniel, Wheel of Time had the biggest impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's funny because we look at like the Larry Elmore covers. Like Larry Elmore's covers, still to this day, you watch them, you're like, you look at that, you're like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know any of these characters. Wow.
Yeah.
And usually the guy on the cover looks like he does a lot of steroids.
I like to see the Brandon Sanderson books have still kind of kept with that tradition of art. And when you look at his covers, they're very beautiful and very, I love Nick's covers, man. I love that you did the was that fan art that they did the AC/DC, the old AC/DC cover that they made for the band.
Yeah. Yeah, and the French covers use that painting too, or that old AC/DC photo too. Yeah.
With Kings of the Wild, didn't they do like an AC/DC cover?
No, not really. Yeah. Sorry, with the French Kings of the Wild, they did. Yeah, they had the main guy throwing up the horns or whatever they're called.
Yeah. I think somebody might have done some fan art and did like an AC/DC cover.
Yeah.
Nick gets all the cool people doing fan art because it's
I know,
cool.
right? I need to get fans of my books who are artists.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, my cover artist was did fan art for Nick.
Yeah. Yeah, Nick, what about you? What was your introduction to the fantasy genre?
Mine was a pretty typical story. Someone left a copy of Fellowship of the Ring in my incubator as a baby, and I read it. I skipped the songs, obviously. Skipped the long descriptions of wilderness. But yeah, no, Lord of the Rings was my first introduction to it. And my first introduction to something that is somewhat unique to fantasy in the fact that it was a trilogy. So I remember getting to the end of Two Towers and Frodo is alive but taken by the enemy, and I was just hooked from then on.
Yeah, at the end of that.
And then I probably stopped until I was about 20 or so, and I started reading religiously again. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I remember.
But yeah, I started reading until I was about 20 or so, and then I started at the same time. I was reading a lot of. Sorry, are we?
Sorry.
A little bit of lag here.
Sorry, guys. I think I'm lagging a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, that's. I don't know if.
Okay. Anyways, when I was about 20, I started reading. Gabriel K books and all the Dungeons and Dragons books at the same time, which is probably why my writing's a little bit in the middle of that.
What an education! I remember. This was well before the internet. Reading The Nine Princes in Amber, which is Roger Zelazny, and Nine Princes of Amber ends on a cliffhanger where the character is literally locked away. He's been blinded, and you're like, what happens? And I had to wait another 3 months to get the next book. And you're like, what? Because you're sitting there, and the Nine Princes of Amber is, I mean, if there's I wish somebody would actually do, books that should complete your education in the fantasy genre, because unfortunately, so much of the literary fantasy does not have a clear timeline in terms of stuff that is amazing, and we're dropping behind some amazing works. I mean, everybody reads Tolkien. The Wheel of Time is a must read. I would put in there, but we're forgetting some of the stuff that informed the genre. Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melnino Bay.
I think it's a shame how Anne McCaffrey was sort of. She didn't she just recently get named like Grandmaster of some organization, like prestigious organization? And, like just recently, I'm like, man, I wouldn't say she's an influential as Tolkien, but damn, I mean, she is like she inspired me as much as almost any other writer, and yet she's just now getting recognized. What's that about? I mean,
Fitz Lieber, Bard of the Grey Mouser, Michael Moorcock. These are authors that we do not hear as much of these days, but have an amazing impact on the genre. You can take a direct line to any anti-hero right back to Elric of Melnino Bay and Conan the Barbarian and so on in fantasy. We can see the same thing in terms of our epic tropes. Nine Princes in Amber is an amazing early indicator of I don't know if you could call that one a portal fantasy, or if you would call it a proto urban fantasy, because it's kind of got elements of both.
I'm curious what Daniel, because he's a reviewer, and he's also younger, and you're younger, so you also get kind of a unique perspective, because you're seeing what I'm 48. Nicholas, I think, you 40? So we have a pretty broad range of ages here and influences.
I'm 29, bro.
The trends that you're seeing as a younger reviewer, when you with a sizable following, I'm curious of what you're seeing, like a direction. Do you see a direction fantasy's going?
So I like to study this like textbook. Like, I really like going into who is remembered longest, who has had the largest impact credited to them versus who did it first, things like that. And like in many forms of art, fantasy has had a similar pattern where someone does something pretty radically new, different, and then other people do it as well, but maybe not quite as radical. And the people who are remembered are maybe the people who take that concept, tone it down a little bit, shift it to morph it into what's kind of more standard and more popular. And then they are the people who are remembered for that time frame. You see that kind of happen with, I would even say, Sanderson right now. He's not doing anything very radically different than many others, but he's doing a lot of what's been done before extremely well. So he's not reinventing the genre, but he is punching a very high bar with his influences being so clearly refined in how he now writes. So then you'll have someone who's doing something extremely different. Like, I would say, if you look back, well, another great example would be Le Guin. Le Guin has Wizard of Earthsea, which is this super popular, very approachable from all angles. But if you actually go back to her time, a lot of people were doing stuff similar to that. She just kind of refined the process, made it very popular. And don't get me wrong, Le Guin's a genius who created an amazing universe. But she's now the person who's looked at for that type of writing for that time, even though there were others that did it. I mean, go all the way back to Tolkien. Other people did things kind of like Tolkien, but Tolkien just finally made it so that the mass audience can like it. Same thing happens in music. Same thing happens in paintings. You have the extreme, it gets toned down, it becomes what's popular, and then the people who are right there are remembered from then on out.
It's interesting because, Daniel, you're correct. If you want to listen to a lecture from a New York Times bestselling author, his name is David Farland. He also writes under David Wolverton. And he talks about a wave cycle in popular memory.
Mm-hmm.
That, art, all art, be it literature, be it graphic art, be it music, has a cyclical value to it. And one of the things that I push authors to do is very heavily try and anticipate that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
You miss the wave too early, and your book will sell well and will be remembered within the genre, but will not actually hit, market penetration. Hit it too late, and you're chasing a trend.
And that's right now, I can tell you this next wave is going to be cultural influences from just all over the world. What's sexy, what's selling is just taking all kinds of different cultures and not relying on traditional medieval Europe to blend in, create something that hasn't been seen before for fantasy. That is what I think a lot of audiences are really thirsty for, because the European fantasy is never going to go away. But it's just not, I think, what a lot of people are interested in, because all of a sudden they're realizing that Western authors can write, fantasy inspired by Eastern cultures or African cultures, or even just European countries that aren't typically what we're thinking of. Mediterranean can give you some really unique angles to come from.
We're beginning to see that with N.K. Jesmond, and some of the new wave authors that are coming out. That I'm looking forward to seeing what they do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Larry Correia actually put out a novel that was an epic fantasy set in a kind of Indochina type region, and it's very well done. Not something that I would expect from Larry Correia, but it's very well done. We're seeing N.K. Jensen come in and do some amazing stuff and begin to turn those tropes on their heads. I mean, it's funny because for many years there's been a website that's called Escaping Fantasyland, which is for young authors, and it's like, okay, here's how you get away from the fantasy kitchen sink, and how you get away from static medieval Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I'm ecstatic. I mean, I would have to say that Robert Jordan and putting in cultural influences that were kind of mixed and matched is an early forerunner of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's definitely been peaks earlier on that were kind of glimpses of what's to come, but I think it definitely needed to percolate in the background of fantasy until now, because it's been just this growing desire. And now it's kind of just popping to the surface. I mean, you could even, if you want to be very ambitious, you could say even like the random surgence of zombies in popularity. Zombies come from, I think it's Haitian culture. So there's been little blips of just, okay, this is something from outside the typical cultural influence. But I mean, it's just, I want to see more authors go, okay, what did ancient Greece have in their fantasy? Because it's really well known, but you rarely see a fantasy epic in the style of Greek mythology, and I'd read the crap out of that. That sounds really cool.
Well, I mean, that's what I was talking about what Nick did. I mean, with the whole taking something that was very familiar, like we've all seen rockumentaries and stuff like that, and the way he twisted that. I'm actually curious what inspired that.
Did we lose somebody?
I think we just lost the host.
I think we lost the host. What the hell?
We lost Andy. Who needs them? Just kidding.
But to the published authors
in the meantime, I will answer that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Here he comes. He's back.
Oh, I was just going to say, what inspired?
Our host abandoned us.
Well, I mean, it's funny because
what inspired me was the book Ready Player One.
Ready Player One.
Player One. That was
Yeah, I'd read Ready Player One, and it was a book that was very much about. It was like a love letter to the things that he loved, and it was like very, very fast paced. And in that, the second challenge of it was a Rush song, and it's like a 17-minute big Rush epic. And I read that and started listening to Rush, and I think I was listening to Rush because it's one of those bands like Led Zeppelin that's so tied into fantasy. There's all kinds of quests and magic swords and ancient fountains and citadels and stuff like that. And so I was listening to that, and I think that's where I came up with the idea for it.
Nice.
But sorry, Daniel, you had a question there you're about to ask.
Yeah, I was for anyone, from the angle of an author who's been published, are you now seeing the popularities from, series that are pulling from just an amalgamation of cultures, throw them in the blender and come up with something new? Is there kind of this sudden ooh, I'd like to maybe do something? Are you feeling that urge to, let's go and look at Egyptian mythology? Let's go and look at what the Germanic the tribes were believing in before Rome took them over? Is there kind of more of a drive for that now that you're seeing it selling? Or is it no, in the where I'm sitting at, this is what I know and love, and I kind of am happy there? I'm not trying to imply that must be done, because I didn't want to come across that way. It's still very good and viable to write traditional European fantasy. But are you inspired a bit by what's happening, where the sudden doors open and these new ideas flooding in?
You can go ahead and take this one, Nick.
Sure. I mean, for me, I think a lot of it is I would feel kind of trepidatious doing that, only because a lot of what we're seeing in that's getting popular these days are other cultures represented by people from cultures. So whether it's Fonda Lee writing about fictionalized Hong Kong, or Evan Winter and his books, Tasha Suri and her Empire of I forget what it's called, Empire of Sand. And I think you just gotta be careful when you start writing another culture, whether or not it's your story to tell. I don't think it's by any means off limits. You see Bradley Beaulieu writing an Arabian Nights kind of inspired series, so it can be done. It's got to be done with a lot of research and a lot of care.
Yes.
I'm happy because my God. Now am I gone?
No, you're here.
You were just cutting out a little bit.
Okay. I think when someone from a different culture writes a fantasy inspired by that culture, you get a bit more authenticity than you do with someone just researching it. But I hope in the future that, ultimately, it's fantasy is fantasy. You can make up your own. Yeah. You can make up your own cultures in the end. I'm really, really happy to see people using their own as a basis of it, though.
Well, but then even taking something okay, let's talk about we can take it back to the simplest thing: men writing female characters, women writing male characters, right? From the beginning, fantasy as a genre, a lot of fiction is stepping outside of our realm of comfort, and the only way that we can actually do it properly is with a ton of research, but also like talking to people directly. Getting insight from those kind of people. So I've written some characters that are walking that super, super danger line, where it could, one wrong word, one wrong action could immediately send it into the realm of offensive to an entire demographic of people.
Yeah, so it's right characters, not caricatures. And and when you're, especially when you're approaching, for example, I write gay characters, members of the LGBTQ community, but I don't tend to touch on trans characters, not because I wouldn't. It's just I don't know. I haven't had the relevant experience that I feel I could write them accurately without accidentally maybe wandering into some sort of stereotype. And I wouldn't want that, because I wouldn't want to be inadvertently offensive, So, it's not that maybe that will change in the future, but I can't just go talk to one transgender person and say, now I know about transgender people. That's I gotta have enough experience with that community in order to do it properly. But
that's kind of what I was saying about
what Daniel had asked about, writing outside of the. I'm open to that, but that's also what I'm noticing is wonderful about our genre compared to other genres. I write the more classic style fantasy. I enjoy it. But you have like new types of fantasy, like Evan Winter, Fonda Lee, all the names that you mentioned. It's not taking the place of these Brandon Sandersons of the world. It's an addition too.
Yeah.
And one of the things about our genre that I love is that we don't replace one with the other. We add one to the other.
Mhm.
And I think that's almost unique within genre fiction. If you look at trends and how they all of a sudden will just be one type of this or one type of that, or this is no longer relevant. It doesn't seem like the Tolkien hasn't lost its relevance.
Mhm.
Jordan has never lost its relevance. Anne McCaffrey, all the giants, they're still just as relevant. But now you have guys like Nick writing brand new types of fantasy. Guys like Evan Winter writing brand new types of fantasy. But still, guys like me who can come in there and write a traditional fantasy and still be accepted as part. That I'm not outdated and antiquated. I'm just we're just all part of the same fantasy universe.
See, I see what's happening to fantasy now to be similar in some ways to what happened to sci-fi several decades ago, where sci-fi was very hardcore sci-fi, and then slowly it started morphing after fantasy started more popular, things like this, to being more character-driven than idea-driven. I mean, if you go back and you read Asimov and you compare him to what's hot right now in sci-fi, it's two entirely different genres, really. That from their core concepts and what they're focusing on as a book, it's just different. But I still don't think that means that anything Asimov did for the genre is somehow devalued. I think fantasy is going down a similar path, where we're going to see some radical changes, but you still have hardcore sci-fi books coming out. They still have their fans. They're still popular. It's just that suddenly it's going to be very... I don't know the right word. It's going to branch off into several different directions because, let's be honest, I mean, for nearly a century, a lot of fantasy was people trying to do Tolkien. It was trying to be the next Tolkien, trying to create Tolkien. They try to write a Tolkien-level book in a year, not realizing it was a lifetime's worth of work for them.
I mean, early fantasy was either you tried to do Tolkien or you try to do Howard.
Yeah.
It was one or the other. I mean, and it took a while to get out of that route. And there were early pioneers to that, and I'm a great amount of debt to them.
Mm-hmm.
And science fiction is in very much the same way. I mean, there's certain fantasy that I read now that I loved 25 years ago that I'm like, that dog won't hunt. And then, I read the same thing. I mean, Asimov today comes Asimov, Clark, even a little bit of Heinlein, who was probably one of the more humanistic of the early sci-fi authors.
Mm-hmm.
Comes off as a lot more dry. Characterization than what we see now. I mean, in terms of cultural appropriation, we have to be careful. I think one of the things that one of the books that landed on my desk was from a young gentleman, and my name doesn't show it, and frankly, my face doesn't show it either. I'm Latino.
Mm.
My family is from Andalusia, Spain.
Wow.
So what happens is that I know a lot about Spanish culture, and of course, he is writing about essentially Iberian culture in a fantasy world. And he's like, you did your research, kid. That's good. And then he does stuff where he's like, the gentleman sits down and eats an apple pie. Wait, one more.
No, he did not.
Well, two things. First of all, culturally, and it's funny because this is one where, ironically, I went to Puerto Rico at one point, and I was just starving, so I went to a McDonald's. Pie de la manzana, and I'm looking, and I'm like, pie means foot in Spanish. Mansana is apple. So I'm like, an apple foot? What the hell is an apple foot? Like, is it a bear claw? Like, what is it? Like, I'm literally pulling my brain out trying to figure out what an apple foot is. And then so I finally realized there's no word for pie in Spanish. You have a cake, or you have a torte, or a cookie, but there's no pie. It's not a cultural food. So what the McDonald's did is they just went, okay, it's a pie of the apple. There, it's up there. Okay, that's what we're calling it. Is we're just going to transliterate and go from there.
Well, it's kind of like this Nova. Nova means no go.
Yeah, Nova. That's not the worst of those. Trust me. I actually do an entire panel on if you're going to translate your book, for the love of God, please. Everyone?
Yes. I think I got some
Did I lose
freezing
everyone?
issues here.
Yeah.
Hello?
I'm here.
Hello?
Is everybody here?
I'm here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean,
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, you have. One of the great things about writing fantasy is that I can. What happened?
A swig of Jack Daniels just occurred.
Oh,
That's not fair. I left mine on the porch.
Well, my glass ran out.
Nicholas?
No. One of the great things about writing fantasy is that I can take Greek culture, and I actually have in my indie works used a little bit of the Greek influence. My wife's actually half Greek, half Puerto Rican, so I have a little bit of an advantage that way. And I can use these cultures. I don't have to mirror them exactly. I can, I've used South American cultures. I've used cultures from all over the world, but I haven't come close enough to where you would have to really pay attention to see what I'm doing. But I can use these influences without having to really worry that much about cultural appropriation, because I'm not coming close enough to even if I get it wrong, I'm not trying to get it right. You know what I'm saying? I'm using, I don't think I can't be the only one who does that.
No, and I think that there's I think there's a level of taste there that we can all look at, because, like I said, the book with the Spanish fantasy counterculture, there were other things in there other than just the apple pie that I was like, you're coming close to a Spanish caricature rather than, he pretty much had Tocameda in the book with the serial numbers filed off of it. And I'm like, there's a lot more to the culture than just the Spanish Inquisition and guys with rapiers.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
Bullfighting.
I find there to be a very fine line that does need to be defined when talking about this, though, because I think there is a very distinct difference between trying to write a culture in your book that is representative of a real one, like you were talking about, where it was just not right. And then there's the other side of it where I think as authors, as creative fantasy writers, going through and saying, okay, I'm going to do a lot of research into 5 different cultures and pull a lot of really neat things to blend and create something wholly original and new. I think that's much more okay. I think that's something absolutely, and that's more what I was going for earlier. Like, I'm now constantly trying to look at, okay, what did Germanic tribes before Roman invasion believe? What were their cultures like? Obviously, not a lot's written about that because they didn't exactly have Twitter. So it's interesting to me to then go, okay, I'm going to take from this and kind of blending something entirely original. I think that's the trend we're going to see become more popular. Absolutely. Is just taking all kinds of different pieces of history and religions that have grown and died across the world and crafting new ideas inspired from them.
Do you see anybody that's actually doing a lot of that you've been reading?
I was gonna point out, Daniel, you reviewed Sword of Kaigen, right?
Yep, which exactly is that.
And that was this really interesting mix, because I was born and raised in Japan, and so I got the samurai, like the feel, like that classic samurai story. But it wasn't only samurai. There was a lot of like the Chinese influences in there as well. Not as strong. It was a lot subtler, but it was in there, and that's what made, for me, that was what made the story. So it wasn't a magical samurai story. It was just, it was what I was familiar with, which was the magic and the samurai. But then there was something else in it that was so unique, and that was probably what made the book stand out for me so much. And I think that's what has made so many other books. I mean, like Nick, Kings of the Wild, you know, everybody loves the fact that it's a rock band, but really that's that one little tiny flavor of something new on top of everything else that we already know. We're already familiar with guys teaming up to kill monsters. We're familiar with, you know, the monster forest. There's so much there that we love, but then there's that layer of new. And that's, I think, like there's we're sort of in this position now as authors with so many books out there, especially in the genre, you know, the fantasy genre. There's nothing new under the sun. But then you take everything that is familiar and you put it, like Daniel says, you take all these elements of these cultures to create something unique. Maybe not entirely unique, because it's pulled bits and pieces from everywhere, but it's unique in its amalgamation, as it were.
Agreed. And nothing is created in a vacuum. I mean, Brian McClellan's Powder Mage series is remarkable, and it has elements of French, you know, French proto-revolution, you know, or proto-revolutionary France.
It's super Napoleonic. Like, let's just call it what it is.
Yeah, but then it also puts in like unique magic systems and so on, and it's a wonderful attempt at building a universe that is well thought out and well established, while having a bit of the elements of the familiar, where I go, oh yeah, this is super Napoleonic, or this is you know, this is a little bit more colonial, you know, colonial China, or so on and so forth. I mean, there are authors that are doing that throughout the genre today, and I'm saying more power to them. I mean, go for it. You know, more spices make a better soup.
See, one of the biggest positives in my mind is after reading the Poppy War, and I found out, oh, this is inspired by a lot of real world war crimes that happened, I suddenly got way more depressed learning about human history, because I had no idea about all these things. And then you read them and you get sad, but it's stuff I should have known, and I'm glad I read about. Yeah. But you read about these real life things and you go, oh, I'm very not informed and need to be better informed.
This is
Nick's on a quest.
Just relocating for faster internet, I hope.
But even a more simple example, I would say, is Brent Weeks' Lightbringer. He's definitely mixed together a whole lot of Mediterranean cultures. And if you even look at the map of his world, that's the Mediterranean. And it's different. It feels like it's not what you typically read. And he also
look at his map. It's a map of Europe. You know, I mean, it's not. He's not. You know, he's basically saying, okay, what if this happened? You know, despite his world, he's not making any secrets about this. Not something that is, you know, I mean, he's trying to hide. Yeah, you look at it, it is a map of Europe. The map of his world is a map of Europe.
And speaking of changing things up, he decided to not go with the typical fantasy lore of the gods are so separated. Instead, he brought the religion down to the people on their level. There is a god figure who is our protagonist in a lot of ways. And that, I thought, was a really interesting way to step. It's certainly been done before, but I can't think of many that have had this kind of, the god is the man you are following largely, and he's questioning God. He's questioning the religion that he is the pope of.
Which is again, we're beginning to see more of, and that's a very interesting kind of Buddhist, Taoist kind of philosophy that's brought into a more European setting, which again, mix and match it. That's I love it.
I'll tell you, Mark Lawrence is like the high priest, patron saint of indies too. By the way, which I love Mark to death, but I've never really understood that. He has no particular ties to indie fantasy, but he started the Spiffbo competition, and which has there's no less than at least a dozen entrants, not winners, just people who've entered that have gone on to Big Five contracts.
Yep.
And I mean, and he's done so much for so many people's careers. I just wanted to kind of mention that.
It's awesome to see, and I wish I could do more from my platform, but I have to worry about YouTube algorithm stuff. So I'll try to slip in as much indie things as I can, but unfortunately, there's always a price to be paid. So I have to fight the YouTubes to try and get that balance. But major hats off to Mark, because he didn't have to do any of that, and he is bringing books to. I wouldn't have read Sword of Kaigen. I wouldn't have read several other indie like Never Die if I hadn't first seen him rising them up and saying, "Hey, these are worth checking out. Pay attention."
Well, that's kind of what Alexi does.
I mean, we're seeing in the market
with a lot of indies in the Barge Tower.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, to be fair, do a fair mix, but I believe we're beginning to see a shift in the marketplace. You know, when I started a long time ago, you know, independent authors was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. It's
That's not nice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way: independent is no longer synonymous with fraudulent publishing.
Yeah,
and that's I mean,
Thanks.
honestly, that's a good thing. I want traditional authors. I want hybrid. I want good writing. That's what I want, and that's actually what we're trying to produce with Bard's Tower. Is say, okay, we're going to get everybody together and kind of bring that out. But yeah, I mean, I also think that there is not a. I would make an argument that traditional publishing and independent publishing are very similar industries, but are not actually the same industry.
yeah.
As an indie for 9 years, here's what I can tell you: making it as an indie and making it as a traditionally published author, they're both equally difficult. When I say making it, I mean making sales and making a living and doing it for a living. And so that's the bar to which that's the yardstick by which I'm measuring. So, because I know you always get pushback. Well, my idea of success is different from your idea of success. My idea of success is paying the bills. So,
As it should be.
So you got, but one is quicker than the other. You succeed or fail very fast as an indie, whereas as traditional, it can take years and years and years and years. Mm-hmm. But luckily, because of KDP and contests like Spiffbone, there are other things out there that can raise visibility. You're having a lot of people that are like right now. I'm a hybrid. I have my stuff with Tor, and I have my indie stuff. And I have stuff that I'm doing with Audible. That I was already a hybrid because I had traditional contracts with Audible, and I was doing my own print and Kindles. But I think a lot of people do approach it differently though. They think that I'm going to be an indie because I don't want to wait on all the gatekeepers to tell me whether or not I'm good enough. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is, if you decide to go that route, it takes a certain type of person. And if you're not that type of person, you're not going to do well because it's a complete another skill set you have to have in addition to being a good writer.
Actually, Brian, I would say that they're entirely different. And this is probably not a debate for this time. I would say they're entirely different industries. What I would say is that if you go to a shopping market, and you see there's fresh produce and then there's canned produce about 4 aisles over. Despite the fact that they don't both produce vegetables and sell people vegetables, there are entirely different methods of production, marketing, development, and sales. And that's what I think we're seeing is that in this brand new marketplace, which, I mean, anybody who's paying attention to publishing at all is well aware that the industry is in a complete state of flux. I think we're beginning to see two industries actually emerge out of one.
And with indies, I I am an indie author. And I like by Brian's measure, I would say that I am successful. But you know, you've got people who are pushing the envelope in terms of like strategies and in terms of story. Like I think a lot of like let's say the book Gideon the Ninth. That's probably one of the biggest splashes over the last couple of years. But now it's gotten so big because I think of the push behind it of the publishing industry. I can tell you for a fact that stories of that nature with similar characters were written years ago. They just weren't visible. And so I think in a lot of ways, the indie genre is or the indie aspect of the fantasy genre is pushing the traditional to adapt as well, just like we indies have to adapt to traditional publishing. We all know that traditional publishers are going to release on Monday, so we don't touch Mondays, we get Tuesdays. You know, just things like that. We have to take into account that Brandon Sanderson's book is coming out November something, so that month is going to be dead for sales for everybody else. You know, like these are the things that we have to take into account. But then, you know, you see like the sale of Simon & Schuster, right? Right, or you see the fact that I have heard rumblings that Tor is, you know, they're shuttering their big building in downtown New York and they're moving somewhere else. Like
they are. Yeah, and if I might, Andy, I don't mean to interrupt. You're saying the sale of Simon & Schuster. It is not a sale of Simon & Schuster. It is an auction of Simon & Schuster.
Okay,
that's a much different animal. One is essentially us saying we're selling Simon & Schuster. The other one is saying my parent company is trying to get rid of us by any means necessary, short of us being thrown out the window.
Okay.
And that's a much scarier option because it's Simon & Schuster, where you're like, oh my God. And yes, Tor going to a smaller building. We don't know where Penguin Random House is going to emerge. I mean, I would imagine there have been rumblings for at least 5 years of a shift in the imprint market in Penguin Random House. You know, these are all things that are showing.
They're actually set up in my backyard right now. That's where their office is.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
They're set up in my backyard right now. Dogs barking at them. It's a big
my phone went off about 20 minutes ago, so don't feel so bad.
But that was what I was saying, is that like in a way the indie market is also shifting the way that traditional publishers have to approach things, because you've got people who won't touch a full price a full price book, you know, traditional published book, you know, a $13.99 ebook, when they're like, what, I can get this box set over here for 99 cents, or I pay $10 for Kindle Unlimited and get it all. So in a way, both halves of the whole are making the whole better.
I think that's true. Look at Kings of the Wild. I'm sorry to keep using you as an example, but people are very, very fond of that book, and they're more than willing to pay the price to read it. I think it also depends on the quality of the book and how well it reaches people and how well it touches people. And this is one thing I always say in like my videos that I make on like what it takes to be an indie author, is like it's all really going to boil down to the book, beyond anything else. If it's a good book, it's a good book. If it's not, all the marketing in the world's not going to help you. You know, there are scams out there that people pull, and that's one of the things that gives independent publishing a bad name. People like me and Michael Manning and Daniel Aronson, the guys who's been around since like 2010 to 2012, been fighting against this for years, and we've been trying to raise the bar to where it is today. And I'm very pleased that I was a part of that. But it's going to boil down to, like, you know, people loving Kings of the Wild, and they're willing to, you know, I'd be more than happy to pay $13.99 to read it. You know what I mean? Because it's a good book. And what there are some that I would not, you know, and I think it really does kind of boil down to quality in at the very end of everything.
See, I'm going to disagree with one thing you said there, and that's that no amount of marketing will help a bad book succeed. We've seen many bad books succeed because they know how to market, they know how to hit a target audience that can't identify a bad book, and they'll explode. I mean, that happens. That happens right now, at least from, I'm a very outside perspective. But to me, it seems like the self-publishing boom turned publishing into the Wild West. Suddenly, not even the big five know what's going on. They're freaking out because they are afraid they're going to lose all their potential good books. So they do things like they try and, Tor is an extension of Macmillan. I always say that wrong, but they're an extension. And so that's them trying to compensate to say, no, okay, we have this other company that's going to handle fantasy and sweep up as many of those self-published guys as we can to have a continuation from there.
Yeah,
will that continue on forever? I don't know.
I'm one of 5 indie authors they've picked up in the past couple of years.
Yeah. Well, so everyone's kind of nervous, at least from what I can tell, because there is some real overcompensation. There's some undercompensation. Suddenly we'll have fan fiction get hundreds of millions of people who are a fan of it and make a millionaire out of somebody who just wrote fan fiction. Like, it's a weird time for writing.
It is a very strange time.
And B.L. James, because it started out as Twilight fan fiction and all that. Dude, I would apologize to all the writers all the way to my bank.
And I'll put it this way: we've also seen the converse happen, where I have seen amazing books come out and drop like a lead stone because the marketing is not there. I mean, the reason that I built Rabid Fanboy Marketing to begin with was because I saw a lot of amazing books, some traditional, some independent, that were put out, and I'm like, this is amazing stuff. And because it will not go anywhere because of how it was marketed or presented to the public.
Well, that's one of the reasons I got with your organization. We talked about that when I first, because I'm going around with the Bard's Tower, is because I knew I couldn't count on. I love the people at Tor. I'm not talking bad about them. I'm not, not unhappy with them. But I also know the reality of today's publishing is that if I'm going to have to, if my book is going to get more visibility, I'm going to have to be willing to go out there and do the same stuff I did as an indie. I'm going to have to be able to work just as hard as I always have in order to get the word out. And so, I mean, I think that is one thing that surprises debut authors when they get into traditional publishing is, man, they still got to work on the same stuff they've always had to work on, Yeah.
So right now as well, I'm really curious how you guys view social media and how it can help market your book, because I'm aware social media, even for me, someone who grew up on it, is a beast. It's something you can't control. It's wild. You can't tame it. But at the same time, if you have one post on Reddit that goes to the top of the fantasy subgenre, you'll make a bunch of money or subreddit, because it's there and it's in front of people and it's getting praise or whatever's bringing it up. Is it something that you're thinking like, okay, I need to somehow strategically get into there? Or is it more of if it happens, it happens? How, from your perspective, are you viewing BookTube with people who can suddenly review it, or Reddit or Twitter, or these things that in 15 years ago never would have been a factor for marketing, publishing, things along those lines?
Well, I would say this: have a plan. Have a plan. Have a plan. Have a plan. The number of authors that alarm me that come on out and go, well, gee, I'm gonna just put it out there and see how it works. I'm like, oh, summer child, don't do that.
Those are the people who get in the ring with the bull and just go, I can take it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, no. I mean, you have a shot. Yeah, I mean, I have a shot at taking out Tyson. It doesn't mean that it's a particularly good shot, but that it's a wise idea to take that shot. And there are certain people that I've seen who have taken that approach and have succeeded. I've seen way more people who have taken that approach and failed, and have done horrible mistakes on their career because of such. I would say have a plan. And that plan will not actually go completely as you wish it to, because every author out there, Neil Gaiman, once put out a statement in Sandman, which was about to make $1 million, and that was the title of the guy's book. And we all, every author that I've ever talked to was like, my book is it. We're going to make $1 million. We're going to be awesome. And I go, yes, but that's wonderful. Yes, you might sell the movie rights to your book. You might have the next Martian. You might have the next 50 Shades of Grey, God help us. But let's try, because nothing happens in a vacuum,
All 50 Shades proved is sex sells even in the indie industry. That's all that 50 Shades proved.
Of course, I mean, if I so wish to read, bondage erotica, I would be reading, Story of O or something. But yes, I mean, I was forced to read it because it's my job. And I read it, and I was like, first of all, this person keeps on using terminal velocity in a way that's not. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
I mean, George Lucas used parsec wrong. We can forgive some things.
But she does it repeatedly.
Right.
But the thing is that I read the book, and I was like, okay, it's Story of O with less interesting. With less interesting sex, frankly. I mean, that's what you have on that. Right. Yes, sex sells. That's wonderful. Frank Frazetta has also proven that, because we, let's face it, the Princess Leia bikini came from somewhere, and it was Frank Frazetta. But let's just be honest. There has to be an indicator of quality, and because Daniel, you said, the independent market has turned everything into the Wild West, which I agree with. We also have to look and see what the indicator of quality is going to be going forward, because there has to be one. And I don't mean just reviews, because reviews are subjective.
Oh yeah.
I mean a marker of quality in terms of book development, professional editing, or professional layout, or so on. I mean, this goes beyond whether or not you use the Oxford comma. But these are all things that need to be looked at going forward if the industry is to continue of growth that it currently has. Wow, that sounded like.
See, that's an interesting.
Sorry.
No, I really like what you're saying there. It's like the internet is missing a tool that needs to exist. I mean, we all wish that Goodreads could fill it, but Goodreads is half broken. It's limping along on its last legs, and I'm sure Amazon will either kill it or finally upgrade it. It just needs one or the other to happen. It's just interesting to me.
I lost you there, guys, for a second.
Oh, sorry. What'd you say, Brian?
Said I've seen your videos on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a software engineer. I can tell you, Goodreads is it's an ugly beast. I've gotten emails from them.
Yeah, Goodreads. Don't. I advise authors not to go to Goodreads, and if there's something for the babies that I tell out there, two things: don't read your own reviews. Don't do it. Take your reviews, but don't read them, because that's within lies the path of madness. And avoid Goodreads, because Goodreads is very broken, which is why I would want to have something like a guarantor of quality without a review element to it. Reviews are subjective, but quality of how the material is presented and written and edited is actually something that honestly, if we're going to look at the industry, we're going to have to find.
So coming from my tech background, it sounds like you're thinking about developing an AI that judges prose. And I mean, if Rabid Fanboy wants to help that project, you go right ahead.
But even then, even then, like anything, there's no real way you can't legislate righteousness when it comes to art. I'm going to take the perfect example of Jade City, right? This has been one of the biggest books that people have been talking about since it first came out, right? Everybody who I hear, they like it, right? I didn't enjoy it that much. And I could tell you a lot of the reasons that I didn't enjoy it were things that, as an indie author and having read other indie authors, these are things that we say, oh, this is something that traditionally published books do, so we try to steer away from it. It doesn't mean that Jade City was any less awesome. It was just not the kind of art that resonated with me. Now, could I tell you all the mistakes that Fonda Lee made on purpose in her book, the way she structured it? Sure. There's no way to tell anybody that this specific style of writing is right. So I think, in a way, saying there's got to be a measure of quality is almost impossible, because what defines quality when it comes to words? And I'm not talking about shitty editing or shitty covers or shitty design. I'm just talking about like the actual writing quality.
And I would not actually. I
don't know what pornography is. I know it when I see it.
I would not actually suggest that we look at quality in terms of the prose. I would think quality in terms of the presentation.
Okay.
Because if we have an amazing book and it has pages out of order, or bad line edits, or even bad structural mistakes, I mean, you can even go that far. But I wouldn't go any further than that, because everything else beyond that is subjective. Like
actually, I was speaking to Nick last night, and it's something that we were talking about. I can pick up a book and I can read that just within the first few paragraphs whether or not this person is writing at a professional level. It does. I'm not saying whether or not I enjoy that person's writing one way or the other, but I can look at it and pretty much say, okay, this person's a professional writer. That's not really that hard to do. Yes, the structural editing and things like that. I can take Nick's book. I can take Sanderson's book. I can take anybody's book without knowing who they are and read it. The first page, I can tell you if this person, whether not how good a writer they are, or whether or not I personally enjoy the style. I've never really cared for King's style. I'm not saying, but that's I love it. I mean, it's not that. I know. I just freaked Daniel out. He's a King fanatic. I knew that.
No, you're good. You're good.
But no, it's not that. It's objectively good. I mean, but subjectively, it's objectively good writing. It's subjectively just, I'll read a King book and very much enjoy it, but I'll read Sanderson and enjoy it 10 times more because I enjoy his writing style that much more. They're both writing at professional levels, and it's easy to see when you read that. It's also easy to see when you read an indie who has never seen an editor. It's their first time out, and they're obviously amateur. You can see it in the first few paragraphs. It's so easy to detect. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think what a lot of people forget to add to that is what is enjoyable, what is seen as the approachable mass appeal evolves over time. It's really hard to get someone my age or younger to sit down and read Tolkien even. It's like pulling teeth because they don't like the way it's written. I've heard people say he has bad writing. They don't even know the word prose or something like that, so they'll just say it's badly written, which... okay. But I'll admit, if I wasn't as knowledgeable in the genre as I've forced myself to become, I'm still faking it a bit. We all fake it till we make it. I wouldn't maybe sit down and read Tolkien and go, this is the most enjoyable read. But knowing what I know, I'm able to go, this is a masterpiece and it accomplishes exactly what it was trying to at the time. There's a difference. Yeah. What's popular now is things that read like Sanderson because they're very easy to read. They're very digestible and you're not really losing much. You still can build these massive worlds. You can still have these deep characters. Dalinar is one of the most interesting examples of a psychologically written character we have. But saying Sanderson's prose are on Tolkien level are just inaccurate because he doesn't write that way. He's not trying to.
Nor is he trying to. I mean, right now, the name of the game is accessibility. Mm-hmm. I would say that Tolkien was not writing with the goal to be accessible. He was writing with the goal of trying to keep the languages that he was learning as a professor alive. and essentially building a framework around that. Now, I would find his world building spectacular, but yes, it is off-putting, and some other early authors are just as off-putting, whereas we have seen that development into accessibility. Anderson is one of them. Brent Weeks is another. Brent Weeks, I would say, is another. There's a Jim Butcher's fantasy series, Furies of Calderon, is fascinating because he writes a Roman culture, but he does it with a level of accessibility that is modern age, and I find that remarkable, and quite a feat in and of itself.
I've noticed about Tolkien that if you don't read Tolkien when you're young, after you've already read a lot of books and read a lot of modern prose, that you do struggle with it. It's like, I've noticed that a lot, especially because when people finally clued into the fact that you can write fantasy with contemporary language, that you don't have to sound like Tolkien, and people more. And I think that as much as anything else drew people into the genre.
And you can still have beautiful prose as well with that. I just got done reading with the Dragonbone Chair, and the prose in that are outstanding. Tad Williams is a spectacular writer. I said in my review I just recorded, you can read one sentence and go, "Oh, this guy's smarter than me." But so there is a balance to still be had, and there are people who just discount modern fantasy though and just say it cannot be eloquent or beautiful, and I think that's wrong. I think there's just an evolution occurring.
Yeah,
I heard from Nick. Any thoughts on this, Nick?
I'm curious that Nick's just going to come out and be like, "I disagree with everyone. Y'all are wrong."
Yeah, I definitely disagree with not reading Goodreads reviews. You should read mine; they're spectacular.
We were just talking about
I'm
that.
just kidding.
I know that day one, if I ever put out a book, I will be sitting on Goodreads and just weeping, but that's okay.
So if you look at some of the people who leave reviews and look at their average star reviews, you're like, look, why do you read? You hate everything. I mean, average 5,000 reviews, average star rating.
And to be fair, reading good reviews is almost.
Why do you do this to yourself?
Nicholas, you cut off there for a bit.
To be fair, reading good reviews can be almost as detrimental. Sorry, can you hear now?
Yeah, you're good.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think reading good reviews can be just as detrimental as bad reviews because so I think they kind of get in your head sometimes, and you're like, well, what I'm writing now is a shitty draft compared to this beautifully eloquent line this person quoted.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I think I know it definitely affected me adversely. It's Cry Me a River, I know, but
that's what I call fifth hurdle issues. Actually, if you're around me for any amount of time as a writer, you'll hear me mention the 5 hurdles of writing. The first hurdle being get it done. Second hurdle being congratulations, you finished the book. Now do it again in 6 months. Third hurdle is don't you know who I am? Fourth hurdle is I have arrived. And fifth hurdle is I will never be able to produce a book better than my last book. And that's exactly fifth hurdle. And writers have
Williams and realize how bad you really are.
I mean, because there's so many authors out there who have produced a book and have, much to their detriment, had that book take off, and then they realize, like, oh my God, no one wants to read anything else but what I've written in this. An early example of that would be Frank Herbert. Frankly, Frank Herbert wrote Dune, and Dune being the best-selling science fiction book of all time, it beats everybody else by an order of magnitude. Now, he sold that to a magazine company that was actually publishing, what was it? Like Gearhead magazines, essentially. And they published that book. And it sold more than he ever in his wildest dreams of avarice. And then he was like, okay, I have these other worlds to explore. And everyone went, yeah, these are good. We like them. When's the next Dune movie? When's the next Dune book coming out? You know,
Rowling suffered the same thing when she tried to write A Cuckoo's Calling, which is
absolutely,
to me objective. To me, was a good book, but it didn't have Dumbledore in it. Nobody wanted to read the damn thing.
Rowling has taken Harry Potter and made it clear she does not really care to be involved anymore, and that's fine. She has every right to do that as an artist. I will never say she shouldn't. But I'm also, as a Harry Potter fan, allowed to say, and now I'm not interested because it came from you, and I want it to continue to come from you. So there's I get both sides, and I'll never blame. Like, it's like the people who are telling Martin, when's the next book? It's art. Let him art. He needs his time. You can't rush it. End of story.
Trust me. With some of the people that I represent, I have sometimes put a sign outside their signing station that says, please do not ask this question. This question is not to be asked. Do not ask it, because when you do, I get upset. You know, and that goes for George, that goes for Patrick, that goes for a lot of authors out there that I'm like, please let them do their work. Yes, they might have been able to do 12 books in a row in a year. Wonderful. Some can't. Sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes it takes less. You cannot, you know, if you rush a miracle worker, you get lousy miracles.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then there's people who will say, well, King came out with 2 books in that last year. Well, King has ghostwriters. And then there's people who say, well, Brandon did this many words in this many hours. Well, Brandon's a robot pretending to be a human. So you can't compare.
Oh, God. I am not telling Brandon that one, but yeah, that is, you know, it's funny because like there are authors out there who are like, I had to reinvent my entire method of writing once I started doing this full time. There are authors out there who took, there was one guy who took a graveyard shift at the hotel. He was the front desk clerk at a hotel. And that's where he got his writing done, was, you know, at 2 a.m, no one's coming into a hotel. So he would just write, you know, he would write then. When he stopped doing that, he had to actually recreate his method of work.
Nick, didn't you go to Cuba to go write your book?
I did.
Who was that?
Didn't work very well. I did.
Too much rum, not enough words.
Yeah, last June I went to Cuba for the entire month. I didn't really do anything. We'll see if I can write it off of my taxes or not. But I just went there with the intention of getting away. I went to Havana for a couple days, but otherwise I went there to write. So
Rum diary anytime.
Didn't help.
That's amazing, man. That's pretty
We're going to do Rum diary anytime soon.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? We are
not.
officially over time. We were supposed to go an hour long, and it's been an hour 17. So this was a whole lot of fun. Thank you guys so much for leading this thing, essentially.
This is a pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me on.
a lot of
Thank
fun.
you for having me on.
That's awesome. All right. Well, we will be
nice
back
to meet you.
on. Oh, yeah. We will be back with Nicholas. When are we having you on, Nick? This is my way of asking when the book's coming out, which is one of those questions I'm not allowed to ask.
Yeah, exactly. You'll have gray in your beard. I'll tell you that. No,
Too late.
I'll let you know. I'll keep you
Way
posted.
too late for me, my friend.
Yeah.
Way too late.
I'll keep you both. Try to
Good.
out Facebook Messenger.
Excellent. All right. Well, that is it for this podcast. I'll be dropping links in the comments where you can find all these awesome peoples. If you enjoyed it, which hopefully you did, like and subscribe, share, whatever you want. Come back. We will be back on Thursday night with a super awesome guest author whose name I can't remember offhand, but it's going to be fun. Thank you and have a great day.
Hey, and thank you everybody for agreeing to do this, man. I really had a lot of